There is a version of you walking around right now who apologizes for taking up space. You've seen him. You've been him this morning, maybe, without even noticing it happening. He shrinks his voice in meetings he should be leading. He waits for someone else to hand him permission to stand up straight. And here's the question that ought to keep you up tonight, turning over in the dark long after everyone else in the house has gone quiet. What if the crown was never the thing you were waiting on? What if you've had it backwards this whole time, thinking the title, the money, the recognition would come first, and then, only then, you'd finally carry yourself like you matter? What if that order is exactly why you're still waiting, still small, still apologizing for a life that hasn't even started yet? Think about the last time you actually felt like a man in charge of his own direction, even for an afternoon. Was it tied to anything you owned, anything anyone gave you, any title stitched onto a business card? Or was it tied to something quieter, a decision you kept, a promise you didn't break, a moment you handled with more steadiness than you expected from yourself? If you're honest, it was probably the second one. And if that's true, then everything you've been chasing on the outside to finally feel like somebody might have been available to you the entire time, sitting just on the other side of a decision you kept putting off. Because here's the truth, nobody hands you early enough. Kings are not made by crowns. Crowns are given to people who were already behaving like kings long before anyone else noticed. The posture comes first. The presence comes first. The discipline, the standards, the way a man treats his own time and his own word, all of that comes first. And most people have it in reverse. They're waiting for permission from the outside world to finally respect themselves on the inside. So they slouch through their 20s. They slouch through their 30s, telling themselves the same story with a slightly older face. And one day they look up and wonder why the crown never came, not realizing they never once carried themselves like it was already theirs to lose. Maybe that's you right now. Maybe you're sitting there, phone in hand, telling yourself you'll start taking yourself seriously once things change, once the job gets better, once the relationship stabilizes, once you finally feel like you've earned it. Perhaps right now you're waiting for a green light that isn't coming, because nobody is going to walk up to you and say, "Today you are allowed to respect yourself." That light has to come from inside the house. And if you don't turn it on yourself, it stays dark no matter how good your circumstances eventually get. You could win the promotion, move into the bigger house, drive the nicer car, and still walk through all of it hunched over, still waiting for the next thing to finally make you feel like enough. Maybe you've noticed it in the small ways. The way you let people interrupt you and don't say anything. The way you say yes to things that drain you because saying no still feels like a fight you're not ready to have. The way you look in the mirror some mornings and see someone who's just getting by, not someone who's building something worth respecting. Perhaps you've caught yourself blaming the traffic, the economy, your boss, your upbringing, your bad luck. Anything but the plain, uncomfortable fact that you've been managing your life instead of leading it. And listen, that's not a character flaw. That's just what happens when nobody ever taught you that dignity is a discipline, not a reward you're issued once you've proven yourself. Maybe you're waiting for motivation to strike before you clean up your habits. You tell yourself, when I feel like it, I'll get serious. But motivation is a fickle guest. It shows up for the fireworks and leaves before the real work even starts. So you drift, not falling apart exactly, just drifting quietly, the way a boat drifts when nobody's holding the oars. Days blur into weeks. Weeks blur into years you can barely account for. And drifting, if you let it run long enough, becomes its own kind of destination, one you never chose but somehow ended up living in anyway, decorating the walls, telling yourself this is just how life turned out for someone like you. And maybe the hardest part isn't even the drifting itself. Maybe it's how normal it starts to feel. You get used to the version of yourself that settles. You stop noticing the slouch because everyone around you is slouching too. And a room full of people hunched over their own excuses starts to feel like the standard, not the exception. Nobody sends you a notice telling you the window's closing. There's no alarm that goes off warning you that another year of waiting just quietly slipped by while you told yourself you'd get to it. That's exactly what makes drifting so dangerous. It never announces itself as a crisis. It just feels like an ordinary Tuesday, over and over, until the ordinary Tuesdays add up to a life you didn't build on purpose. Ask yourself plainly when the last time was you did something simply because you said you would, not because anyone was checking. Maybe you've told yourself it's temporary. Maybe you've said, "This is just a rough patch. This isn't really me. I'll snap out of it soon enough." And maybe that's even true. But how many rough patches can a man call temporary before he has to admit it's simply become his address? How many Mondays does he get to promise himself before the promise itself starts sounding hollow, even to him? Perhaps you've noticed that the goals you set in January sound suspiciously similar to the goals you set the January before that, and the one before that too, worn smooth from repetition, like a stone you keep picking up and putting back down in the exact same spot. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when a man keeps setting intentions without ever installing the discipline underneath them to hold the weight. So let's talk about how a person actually becomes someone who carries himself like a king long before any crown shows up. Because it isn't mystery, and it isn't luck, and it certainly isn't something you were either born with or without. It's a handful of simple disciplines, practiced daily, compounding quietly while nobody's watching, until one day the compounding becomes undeniable even to the people who doubted you. The first thing you have to understand is that life runs in seasons, and you don't get a vote on which season shows up. Spring doesn't ask your permission. Winter doesn't check your calendar before it arrives. There will be seasons of ease and seasons that test you down to the bone, and no amount of complaining will move that calendar along any faster. What you do get a vote on is what you do inside each season. A farmer doesn't get to cancel winter. He can stand in his field shouting at the sky about how unfair the frost is, and the frost will not apologize and will not leave early. But he decides whether he spends that winter repairing his tools, studying his land, and preparing his seed, or whether he spends it huddled by the fire complaining about the cold until spring simply happens to him instead of for him. Same winter, two completely different men walking out the other side of it. One is ready the moment the thaw comes. The other is still frozen inside, wondering why nothing ever seems to break his way. This is the first mark of someone who carries himself like royalty before the crown arrives. He stops arguing with the weather and starts preparing inside of it, whatever it happens to be. Your action step here is simple, and it starts today. Whatever season you're standing in right now, comfortable or brutal, pick one thing you can build, repair, or strengthen inside of it this week. Not when it gets easier. Now, in the season you're actually living in, not the one you wish you had instead. The season will change eventually, that part's guaranteed. The only real question is whether it finds you ready or finds you exactly where it left you. The second thing that separates the ones who eventually wear the crown from the ones who spend their whole lives auditioning for it is what they do with their days when nothing dramatic is happening at all. Success was never one grand gesture. It was never a single heroic sprint that changes everything overnight. It is a few small disciplines, repeated on ordinary Tuesdays when nobody is filming and nobody is clapping and no one would even notice if you skipped it. Failure works exactly the same way, quietly, in the opposite direction. A few easy errors in judgment, repeated daily, compound into a wrecked decade the same way discipline compounds into a strong one. The tragedy is that both paths feel almost identical in the moment they're being chosen. Skipping the workout once feels harmless. Reading 10 pages instead of scrolling for 2 more hours feels like it barely matters tonight. Just this once. But you are not being judged on tonight. You are being judged on what tonight becomes when you repeat that same small choice for the next 1,000 nights in a row. It's rarely the big collapse that ruins most people. It's a series of small, forgivable choices, forgiven so many times in a row that they stopped feeling like choices at all and started feeling like identity. Here's your action step. Pick one discipline this week, something small enough that you cannot talk yourself out of it on a bad day, and do it daily without negotiating with yourself about the terms. Not because one day of it changes your life, because it starts teaching your own mind that your word to yourself actually means something again. That's the real prize hiding inside small disciplines. Not the six-pack, not the bank balance, but the quiet, growing evidence that when you say you'll do something, you actually do it. The third principle is one people resist the hardest because it quietly takes the excuse away, and excuses, whatever else you want to say about them, are comfortable. It is not what happens to you that shapes your life. It's what you do about what happens to you. Two people can lose the same job on the very same afternoon. One spends the next 6 months telling anyone who'll sit still long enough how unfair it all was. The other treats it as the ugly, uninvited beginning of something better, and starts building the next thing that same week, sometimes that same night. Same circumstance handed to two different people, two entirely different lives grow out of identical soil. This doesn't mean pretending the hard thing didn't hurt, or performing strength you don't feel yet. It means refusing to let the hard thing get the final word on who you're going to become because of it. A king in waiting understands that circumstances are simply raw material, sometimes generous, often brutal, but never the final author of the story. You are the final author, whether you've been acting like it or not. Your action step is this. Take one situation you've been quietly blaming on outside circumstances and write down, honestly, one thing that is still within your control regarding it. Just one thing. Then, go do it before the day ends, before you have time to talk yourself out of it. Notice, too, how much lighter that feels than carrying the blame around. Blame is heavy to hold for very long. Ownership, strangely enough, is the thing that actually sets a man's shoulders back down where they belong. The fourth principle is one Rohn built much of his teaching around, and most people underestimate exactly how much power it holds over their lives. You become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Not because those people control you directly, but because we absorb the standards of the room we're standing in without ever consciously realizing it's happening. Spend enough time around people who treat mediocrity as normal, and mediocrity starts to quietly feel normal to you too, like a comfortable pair of shoes you forgot you were wearing. Spend time instead around people who take their words seriously, who show up early, who talk about building instead of complaining, and something in you quietly rises to meet them, because none of us wants to be the weak link standing next to people we genuinely respect. This is not about abandoning people you love, and it's not an invitation to arrogance. It's about being honest with yourself about which relationships are stretching you upward and which ones are slowly, politely, lovingly keeping you small and calling it loyalty. A king surrounds himself with a court that reflects the standard he's trying to hold himself to, not out of vanity, but out of self-respect. Your action step this week is to look honestly at the 5 people whose opinions and habits shape your days the most, and ask yourself plainly which ones are pulling you forward and which ones you've simply been making excuses for. You don't need to burn any bridges over this. Sometimes the answer isn't subtraction at all. It's simply spending a little less time in rooms that shrink you and a little more time in rooms that stretch you until the balance quietly shifts on its own. The 5th principle is the one that ties everything else together, and it's about the garden because Rohn loved coming back to the garden more than almost anything else. Life is a garden, and it does not care one bit about your intentions. It does not grow what you meant to plant, what you thought about planting, what you'll plant eventually once you get around to it. It grows exactly what you actually planted, tended, and watered. Nothing more generous than that, and nothing less fair either. If you plant nothing, you don't get an empty, patient field waiting for you. You get weeds because the ground doesn't sit idle just because you didn't show up with seeds in your hand. Neglect isn't neutral. Neglect is its own harvest, and it comes in whether you invited it or not. This is why waiting to feel ready, waiting to feel motivated, waiting for the crown before you start acting like it's already yours, is such a costly delay to keep paying. Every day you wait is a day the field grows something anyway, usually something you didn't want and won't enjoy pulling out later. The people who eventually carry themselves like royalty are the ones who accepted early that they are the gardener, whether they wanted that job or not, and started planting on ordinary days instead of waiting around for extraordinary ones to show up and do it for them. Your action step is to name one seed, one habit, one relationship, one skill that you are going to plant today on purpose, regardless of how you happen to feel about it this particular morning. And here's the part most people skip past too quickly. A garden also needs weeding, not just planting. It's not enough to add good habits if you never pull the ones quietly choking them out. Ask yourself honestly what's been growing in your field without your permission, and start removing at least one thing this week, even if it's just 20 minutes of scrolling you replace with silence. And here's a sixth thing, quieter than the rest, but maybe the one that matters most for a title like this one. Carrying yourself like a king isn't about looking down on anyone else. It's not about ego, and it's not about performing confidence for an audience that's watching you pretend. It's about the private decision to stop negotiating your own standards down to match your worst days. It's choosing to speak to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you deeply respected, even on the mornings you don't feel like you've earned that respect yet, especially on those mornings. Because the truth is, respect that only shows up after you've already proven yourself isn't respect at all. It's a transaction, and a cold one at that. Real dignity is extended on credit before all the evidence is in. The same way you'd offer faith to a friend who was still finding his footing and hadn't proven anything to anyone yet. Your action step is this. Today, catch yourself the next time you speak badly about yourself inside your own head, and correct it out loud, even if it feels foolish standing there talking to an empty room. Especially if it feels foolish. That discomfort is the exact sound of an old habit finally being challenged. Do this enough times, and something shifts. The correction stops feeling foolish and starts feeling like the truth finally getting a word in edgewise. There's a seventh thing worth naming here, and it's about direction, because discipline without direction just makes you very efficient at going nowhere. A ship without a destination doesn't drift gracefully. It drifts dangerously, at the mercy of whatever current happens to be strongest that week. Setting a goal isn't some corporate exercise you do once a year with a notepad and forget about by February. It's the simple adult act of deciding, on paper, in specific language, exactly what you're building towards so that your daily disciplines have somewhere to aim instead of just spinning in place. Most people never write their goals down at all, and then they wonder why their effort feels scattered, why they're busy without feeling like they're actually getting anywhere. A king in waiting treats his goals the way a captain treats a compass heading, checked often, adjusted when the winds demand it, but never abandoned just because the crossing got rough. Your action step here is to take 5 minutes today and write down in plain language exactly what you're working toward over the next 12 months. Not a vague feeling, a specific target you could explain to a stranger in one sentence. There's an eighth thing, and it might be the one that finally tips the scale for you tonight. Every single person alive is going to carry some kind of pain. That part isn't optional, no matter how carefully you plan your life. What is optional is which pain you carry. There's the pain of discipline, the alarm going off before you want it to, the harder conversation you have instead of avoiding it, the money you save instead of spend. That pain weighs a few ounces. And then there's the pain of regret, the sinking feeling 5 years from now when you're standing exactly where you're standing tonight, except older, having changed nothing, wondering where the time actually went. That pain weighs tons, and it doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives slowly, compounding in the background while you were busy telling yourself you had plenty of time left to start. A king in waiting picks his pain on purpose, early, instead of letting the years pick it for him by default. Nobody ever regrets the early mornings. Almost everyone regrets the years they slept through instead. Your action step is to ask yourself honestly, right now, which of those two pains you've been quietly choosing for yourself this past year, and whether you're willing to keep choosing it for one more. Because both pains get paid eventually, one way or another. The only choice you actually have is which one you pay first and which one you leave sitting on the table, gathering interest, waiting for you. There's a ninth thing worth mentioning, small on the surface, but heavy underneath. The people who eventually carry themselves like royalty tend to build small rituals around the start and end of their days, because a life without any structure at the edges tends to leak out through the middle. It doesn't have to be complicated. It might be 5 quiet minutes before the phone comes out in the morning. It might be writing down one thing you're proud of before you close your eyes at night. These aren't magic. They're bookends. And bookends are what keep the rest of the shelf from collapsing in on itself. Your action step is to choose one small ritual, no more than 5 minutes, and anchor it to something you already do every day without fail, like brushing your teeth or making coffee, so it has something sturdy to hold on to while it becomes automatic. Now let me be honest with you for a minute, because I think you deserve that more than another pep talk dressed up in nicer language. I know what it's like to look in the mirror and not recognize the tired version staring back at you, wondering when exactly he started looking so worn down. I know what it's like to say I'll start Monday, and then Monday shows up and gets swallowed the same way every other day gets swallowed. By tiredness, by doubt, by the quiet voice that whispers, "Who are you to think you deserve better than this?" That voice lies to you. It lies convincingly, because it borrows your own voice to do it, wears your own face while it talks. But it lies, every single time. You were never meant to wait for a crown to know your own worth. The crown, if it ever comes, is simply the world finally catching up to a truth you should have decided a long time ago on some ordinary morning nobody else was watching. I'll tell you something else, because it's easier to hear from someone willing to admit it about himself first. There were seasons I spent more energy defending my excuses than it would have taken to just fix the thing I was making excuses about. I got good at explaining why this year wasn't the year, why the timing was off, why someone else's head start meant my own start didn't count for much. And the exhausting part wasn't the work I was avoiding. The exhausting part was maintaining the story. Keeping a good excuse alive takes constant upkeep. You have to keep feeding it, keep defending it at dinner tables and in the quiet of your own head at 2 in the morning. Discipline, it turns out, is actually the easier road. It just doesn't look that way from where you're standing at the start of it, tired and unconvinced. Maybe you've spent years being the reliable one for everybody except yourself, showing up early for other people's emergencies while your own goals sat untouched in a drawer somewhere, gathering dust, waiting for a version of you that always seemed to be one season away. Maybe you've mistaken exhaustion for productivity, filled your days with motion that never actually pointed anywhere, and called it being busy because busy at least sounds like something. There's no shame sitting in that admission. Nearly everyone passes through a stretch like that. The shame only shows up if you already know all of this and still choose tonight to do nothing different with it. And maybe what's kept you stuck longest isn't laziness at all, whatever that tired old word even means. Maybe it's fear dressed up as caution. Fear that if you actually tried fully, without the built-in excuse of half effort to fall back on, and it still didn't work, you'd have to face something harder than failure. You'd have to face the truth about your own ceiling. So it feels safer to stay in the comfortable middle, half trying, always able to say you never really gave it your all. But that middle ground isn't safe. It's just slower. It costs you the same years either way. It just does it quietly enough that you don't notice the bill until much later. Carry yourself like a king long before the crown ever comes. That's not a slogan you hang on a wall and forget about. It's an instruction, and it starts with the smallest, most unglamorous decisions imaginable. It starts with making your bed like it actually matters, even when nobody's grading you on it. It starts with keeping the promise you made to yourself at 6 in the morning, even though nobody else would ever know if you quietly broke it. It starts with speaking to the person in the mirror like he's someone you're still building, patiently, brick by brick, instead of someone you already gave up on and settled for. You can't change the seasons, but you can change yourself inside of them, season after season, year after year, until the changing becomes who you are. You can't undo the years you already spent waiting for permission that was never coming. But you can stop waiting today, in this exact hour, before the day gets a chance to talk you out of it the way it has so many other days before this one. It's not what happens to you. It's what you do about it. Say that back to yourself the next time life hands you a perfectly good reason to shrink. It's not what happens to you. It's what you do about it. Think about the man you'll be in 5 years if you change nothing starting tonight. Not out of punishment, just honestly, plainly, picture him. Same habits, slightly more tired. Same excuses, slightly more polished from repetition. Now picture the other one. The one who took the small, unglamorous action steps seriously starting this week. Who planted on ordinary days instead of waiting for extraordinary ones. Who stopped auditioning for a crown and simply started acting like a man worth respecting, one small decision at a time. Both of those men exist right now, as possibilities, standing at the exact same starting line you're standing at tonight. Only one of them gets to actually exist 5 years from now. The choosing happens in these next 24 hours, not in some someday that keeps sliding further down the calendar. Here is the one line I want you to leave with tonight. The one I want echoing in your head when you're lying there deciding whether tomorrow is going to be the same as today. A king doesn't wait for the crown to start acting like one. He becomes one. And the crown, when it finally shows up, is simply running late. Let that sit with you for a moment before you move on with your evening. Read it back to yourself tomorrow morning if you need to hear it again. In the next 24 hours, I want you to do exactly one thing. Pick the discipline from everything we just talked about that made you most uncomfortable, the one your gut already flinched at while you were listening, and do that one first, before anything else on your list. Not the easy one you were already planning to do anyway, the one you flinched at. That flinch is information. It's usually pointing directly at the exact thing that's been standing between you and the version of yourself you've been describing to other people but haven't quite become yet. Don't wait for Monday to make it official. Don't wait for a fresh notebook or a new year or some cleaner starting line that feels more symbolic. Kings don't wait for symbolic starting lines. They start wherever they happen to be standing, on whatever ordinary day it happens to be, because they understand that the starting line was never the point. The discipline that follows it is. And before you go, tell me, one word right here in the comments, the discipline you're committing to starting tomorrow morning, whether anyone is watching or not. Not a paragraph explaining yourself. One word. Something you can come back and hold yourself accountable to in 30 days when this video is long forgotten, but the habit either is or isn't still standing. Write it down somewhere you'll actually see it, on your mirror, your lock screen, the inside cover of whatever you're reading next. Then go live like you already meant it, starting with the very next decision you make after this video ends.